Hi everyone, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast about men, masculinities and gender equality. It's Sandy Ruxton here, and I'm with Stephen Burrell as always.
Hi Sandy, and hi everyone. Yes, in this episode we're looking in particular at issues faced by older men. We have with us Shay Franklin, who's based in the Republic of Ireland, and he's done a lot of work over the years on men and masculinity issues, including a lot of work with older men at organisations such as the Men's Development Network in Ireland and the Men Engage Alliance. Is that right, Shay?
That's true. Good to see you this morning. For me, yes, I've been sitting, what I describe as sitting in circles with men for about 25 years in one setting or another, whether it is around health or as my latter years, as I got older, the men that I was sitting with became older as well. And in fact, I've stopped saying older, I just now say old, admitting that I am old. Somebody born in 1951, officially, as far as where I'm sitting, is an old man. And that masculinity is an interesting one to look at.
Absolutely.
If you recall, we interviewed Colm Kelly-Ryan from the Men's Development Network on a previous episode of Now and Men, which is entitled Men Marching Against Violence Against Women. That was when Stephen and I and various others were in Seville. So thanks for speaking to us, Shay. We're really interested in the work you do with different groups of older men in Ireland. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about what that involves? What do you actually do in the groups, and how do you initiate and run them?
Okay. It began in a community on the edge of Dublin, which is reasonably described as a marginalised community, with lots of different, diverse, marginalised populations. One of the populations is what I think in the official parlance is called sheltered housing. There's about 120 bed-sit studio units occupied by people in the main over 55, and about 90 of them are men. And they're men who live quite isolated lives, and they have ended up in that situation for a variety of reasons. Some of them are men that migrated to the UK and worked in things like construction when they were in the full of their health and able, as was the situation here in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And those men at this end of their lives are now of no economic use to those organisations that they worked for, and they've returned to Dublin. There are other men who experienced homelessness or addiction, or isolation for a series of other reasons. And most of them will have ended up without family support networks. And the local community is a very active community development project, which has a strong connection with one of the universities. And there's a continuing rolling stream of young people who are on, what would they call it, practice with the community project. And out of that grew what we described as outreach, and outreach meant these young people knocking on doors and basically just checking that the men were still upright or that they didn't need help in any direct way. So that was the first step out of isolation. The next step was that Tommy Coombs, who's the project coordinator, set up a Friday morning old men's breakfast. And that was a community breakfast in the community centre. And it grew from being just a men's breakfast to being a community breakfast. And nowadays there's upwards of 100 people coming to breakfast. And we'd been using kind of the big breakfast as a way to get men in the door in a variety of different places. And basically, by offering breakfast, you give a man cover. He's not coming for support. He's coming for a meal or for some company. And after breakfast, we would retire to an upper room, as they say, and sit in a circle. And over time, and it's 10 or 12 years, we developed a way of being together that set about saying, well, here we sit in a circle because there's no hierarchy. My task here is to be one of this group. I'm an old man like yourselves, and we share time. And as a kind of further endorsement of equality and diversity, that every man is welcome, but also we share time literally, because sometimes men coming out of isolation can come in two different ways. One is they don't really know how to talk, they've forgotten, and the other is they can't stop talking because they don't know how to listen. So with the advent of the blessed iPhone, I'd look around the room and say, there's 8 of us here, we're here for 2 hours, that means you have 15 minutes. Who wants to go first? And while that was a bit uncomfortable in the beginning, we got to a point where we knew each other and we began to trust each other and show that trust in each other by listening. And we agreed that things like, well, we don't interrupt each other, we don't give advice, we listen to a man's struggle, and that's effectively the sum total of it. So that it is about giving good attention, whatever that means. And that means, building community, creating social capital, whatever version of it that you wish. But it was about building community. And men that, were used to living isolated lives began to find a place together. And essentially that's what it had become. COVID wiped it out because these men are not men that have access to technology. Even if they have laptops or iPads, they're not really engaged with stepping over that barrier. I mean, what in fact happened in that community was that Tommy, the coordinator, created a food bank that by the end of the first year was feeding something like 600 people. And some of the men who were part of the men's group were working as volunteers, and some not volunteers in terms of van driving and things like that, as part of the food bank. So there, and that's the real meaning of social capital, and creating community.
And how does masculinity, in your view, fit into this work? I mean, I think you said a little bit about that, but obviously getting older, it can be quite a challenging experience for a lot of men, particularly those you've described as socially disadvantaged. You've got this notion of what being a man is all about that you've grown up with: be tough, be strong, be in control, and then you discover as you age you're not like that.
Yeah, and remember another thing that by the time I'm 60 or 65, I've had a lot of practice at being that man that I have been taught to be. So the shell that I have built has become quite hard and stiff and rigid, and creating a space where that can soften, and the need to be self-reliant or resilient, it begins to weaken. And at one stage there was a series of men with a series of serious physical ailments, and the way we were able to keep check on things was that we had a competition once a month, which was about talking about how many tablets we took every day. So there's the pink one and that's for that, and there's the blue one and that's for that, there's the oval one and that's for that. And and suddenly we have a conversation about the different struggles we have. There was the man who we had a long argument. He got every fortnight he got a serious injection because he struggled with his mental health, and we had an hour on, I only get this once a fortnight, but really, it surely has the value of one a day, and all these, which leads into a conversation about him, how he worries about getting the injection, the side effects of it, the need for it, and suddenly you're stepping past those harsh, rigid masculinities, and you're speaking about and hearing about, and I take 11 tablets every day, 7 of them to keep me well, and the others are to prevent things, supplements and things like that. So for me, stepping in like that, rather than being a disinterested, objective person, part of it was, for me, was being, I am here with you. There was definitely, I'm a middle class man. Very definitely, and it's known and it's clear by the difference in accent and everything else. So we have to accept that. But to be at the same, sitting in the same circle, taking the same time, means that you're stepping past the history of a man that has worked in carrying a hod or digging tunnels, at the wrong end of a hierarchy all his life, or that has, for reasons of class, being marginalized, or for reasons of family background. Maybe he was raised in one of those terrible, in Ireland, they're religious run state funded homes, so that everything going out to contradict his belief about himself, that he doesn't have value. And that's where the breakfast comes from. It says, and twice a year we did what we grandiosely called a Men's Health Day, and we went to a hotel which had a carvery, and we would sit for the day together. And it was in a 3-star local hotel, but it was saying, you are welcome here, you are valued here. So going against, and my context has always been to say, and nowadays we say transforming masculinities. The language we used 25 years ago in the Men's Development Network was contradicting male gender conditioning. We believe men are marginalized by male gender conditioning, that withdrawing away from people. I'm supposed to be stoic and silent. I'm supposed to be strong. I'm supposed to be resilient and self-reliant. And when I'm not able for that, my sense is to pull away and to shrink. I've heard the language of, retreat to my cave. And everything is about contradicting that and understanding and seeing every man as individual.
I was wondering what are some of the impacts that has, Shay, on the men that have taken part in the work you do? Like, have you got any examples of, the positive effect that engaging in this kind of discussion can have?
Well, yeah, I have in my file somewhere a 1-page application for €1,500 to the health system to fund. That was funding for a year of this work. And across the bottom of it, I wrote, in the margin, there's no space in this form to say that 2 men are alive today because of this program that wouldn't be if this program didn't exist. And I know that to be true. And in the days of evidence-based work, work with men, work with old men is slow, steady, and vital, but the reality is that you don't, because so little of it goes on, you don't see the output. In the Men's Health Forum, Ian Banks had a phrase which was, horizontal men are much more expensive than vertical men. In other words, if you're flat on your back in a hospital, it costs an awful lot more to keep you going. And we got written into the men's health policy way back in 2008-9 the idea that community-based services around the idea of the social determinants of health, in other words, isolation and all of the rest. By tackling the isolation, you began to remediate some of the issues.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. You mentioned that actually, because we can't help but notice that in Ireland you have this men's health strategy now, which you've had for a few years. I mean, would you say that that's been quite a useful kind of initiative from your experience, and in any particular ways?
Yes. I mean, I think in particular in that way, in that it allowed activity to be funded by the health service. We have also in parallel, there's the Irish men's sheds, and men's sheds, and they're now pretty well in Irish parlance, in most parishes in the country, we'll have a men's shed of one kind or another. And that's based around bringing men together to do things together. It's a particular version of masculinity that is less developmental than the approach I like, but that's anything that brings men out of isolation is good as far as I'm concerned. So, and they are well funded, and now are a channel in terms of health information, health support, mental health support, and social supports. So they're significant. And the men's health policy did bring the idea of men being gendered beings and their health and responses to health services being gendered to an audience that was never there before. The Men's Development Network are part of a program that supported the health service and social services to get to grips with the idea of, well, here are ways to think about working with men that might be more helpful and encouraging than the normal I'm wagging my finger approach, which, the infantilization of men by the biomedical model is an old hobby horse of mine.
And would you say there are any downsides to that kind of policy approach? Like, does it end up treating men's health and women's health as very separate when obviously in reality they're very interrelated? I mean, I suppose like one big issue for older men perhaps is if they lose their partner, for example, we know that can have quite a detrimental impact on some men. I mean, obviously it would have on anyone, but maybe they become more isolated often. Yeah, do you have any?
I think there is a need for policy to understand that we are gendered beings, and therefore when I turn up, something different might be required than when my partner turns up, my wife turns up, and I think that happens automatically, but it happens against the frame of reference, the perspective of the person in the white. They don't wear white coats anymore. They now wear what do you call it, scrubs. But the person on the other side of the desk. So I'm dependent on them for their version of my masculinity. I mean, I had a heart attack in 2008, and sitting with the doctor soon after that, she handed me stuff about my diet and suggested that I give it to my wife. And I said, "Thank you very much." Do you realize what you're saying? And she was a young doctor, and that was her perspective, and that's the piece that is that needs change. And if you've been trained in the biomedical model, the idea of a social context and therefore gender is miles away.
Mm-hmm. One thing we wondered was what impact doing this kind of work has on you personally. Do you find it helps you to get through challenges you've had in your own life, or does it take a toll on you as well?
All of those. When I and to be clear, I mean, I came to this work at a time in 97 when I was 40, 46, 47, and things were changing in my life. I had a career the career in advertising, where I was realizing that, well, I'm older than most of my colleagues. And it took some time, but about another 5 years before I stepped away from that. And stumbling into my first men's, it was a 2.5 day residential with the Men's Development Network in '97, the 12th of July. I haven't forgotten it. And that was an introduction to, there was about 60, 70 men there. And it was introduction to the idea of vulnerable men, of sitting, because of the time it was, there was also conflict there, because there were men there that were, if you like, with a particular version of masculinity, being more rigid, and we would now describe them as men's rights. I came to know them as the angry men. So it was an introduction to all of that, and to an understanding that, I don't know who says about the unexamined life. When my life had been significantly unexamined until then. I had been busy building a career, and a successful career in the advertising world, which that's where my head was. As things changed for me, as things changed in me, I began to discover other things. So it was sitting in those spaces that I realized the impact of looking back. I grew up in a house that was, while on one hand it was led by a strong feminist woman, but on the other side I lived with more than some chaos and fear, and sometimes terror of violence. And suddenly I was in a space where I could look at all of that and begin to understand its effect on me. One of the things that I had, the benefits I began to recognize, was I was really good at my job in terms of developing communications and business strategy, and I was really good at managing, working with big groups of powerful people. Because I had developed as a small boy a degree of hypervigilance, of being able to read the wind, because I had to be able to read the wind. So what I found was sitting with men and with putting together the agreement that I spoke about with the older men, putting those together, those agreements in place beforehand. It gave structure. It gave, I've seen that man take a risk. I can do some of that. I can step into that. I can begin to understand and work out about myself and how it is to be. During that career in business, one of the things I did was run focus groups, which gave me an understanding that I could run a focus group. And with a bit of training around facilitation, about holding sessions about people's lives rather than about toothpaste or politics or Guinness, which it seemed to me, well, I better validate my experience before stepping in. And I did that, and then I began to volunteer as a facilitator, and then as my career went away, I began to do freelance facilitation, and most of the time I worked with men who were living with the impact of marginalisation of one kind or another. So I worked with Irish traveller men, these older men, men from refugee and asylum seeker backgrounds. And by all of the time, for me, it was about valuing every individual. And a man might turn up with huge weight on his shoulders, but our agreement always was that no man's issue is more important than any other. And by the way, we're not here to give advice or solve your problem. I had a great poem that says, yes, I see the hellacious burden that you carry. No, I won't help you carry it, but I will help you put it down so that you can see it clearly. And fundamentally, that's the experience I've had again and again over the years. And the number of times I've said, God, I thought I dealt with this. And suddenly it comes triggered by something. It could be news. It could be something I experience in a group, something I hear, and it comes. And in that instance, I suppose I developed a practice which was about reflection. And it was about, okay, I heard that. I know I've responded to it, but actually I have a role to play here, which isn't about my response to the resonance. It's actually take it somewhere else and work with it. And in the main, I came to the point where a lot of the work I did was as a pair. So I worked with another man, and there would always be 15 minutes after a session to have something to say about how that landed, so that it's not being swallowed. It comes and is available to be worked at.
I'm interested in what you said a minute ago about the use of poetry as well. You know, I mean, I know we share an interest in Grayson Perry and his TV show. You know, where he enables people to open up about their inner life in a way through their art. I mean, you know, do you want to say a bit more about how you use poetry in that way, and how do you access, you know, the emotional lives of these groups that you're talking about, who are often very, very marginalised, and, as you say, will have built up these shells around them?
Yes, yeah. Well, I don't know who said it or whether I said it first, but when poets are people that put words in the right order, that gets us to places that we won't naturally go, you know. And I don't know, I know a bit about the English education system. The Irish education system does not treat, certainly if you're my age, did not treat pupils very well. And the notion of poetry brings people back to that time, and the resistance can be really strong. When I came to it inspired by Robert Bly and his mythopoetic approach to working with men, so that he would either tell a story or have somebody tell basically a fairy story out of Grimm or out of one of the others, or use his own poetry or other poetry, and then ask the question, and the question, generally speaking, was, and where are you in this? You know? So if you bring a poem like Mary Oliver's Wild Geese saying, you do not have to be good, you do not have to walk for 100 miles on your knees in the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Show me your despair, and I will show you mine. That goes against everything that I was ever taught. I did have to be good, you know. As a 1950s child, being a good boy was all important, not causing trouble, not breaking the rules, living up to, you know, expectations. So to be told you do not have to be good is a really powerful piece of kit, you know. And I would turn up at a group with a sheet with a poem like that on it for every man in the audience, in the circle, the same poem. And we would read it one line at a time, moving from man to man. You do not have to be good. And it would go around maybe for 10 minutes, so that every line was heard by every man from every man. And the power of that, and the release of it, of hearing my voice those words. Suddenly, yes, you're putting words into people's mouths, but you're also putting words into people's hearts and minds that can shake the ground. That's the reality of the power of, you know. William Stafford is another, you know, American poet. They're on the bookshelf here. You know, Heaney, whatever you say nothing. You know, I mean, wow. and the power of those. Just, I remember being challenged by a project we were doing was being evaluated, and I was challenged by the evaluator. Who was sitting, in my terms, sitting on his high horse. But poetry is very middle class, isn't it? Do these men understand? I didn't. In my response to that, and I got called on it later. I used very strong language about his version of these men, and what they could be capable of understanding.
I mean, you mentioned there, Robert Bly, for example, and he has a particular reputation, shall we say. Some feminists would say, well, Robert Bly tends to leave women out of the equation and so on and so forth. But now, you're part of the Men Engaged network, which is an avowedly, feminist, pro-feminist network,
Yes.
whatever you want to call it. So I'm kind of interested in you've been on a bit of a journey, and I believe
Yes.
we're all on a bit of a journey. But I wondered if you could say something about that for you as well.
Okay, a series of journeys, really. Some of you will have heard me say I'm an old, white, middle-class Irish man. And those are all bits of identity that are describing my bits of identity. And I had to learn that each of those meant that I had a degree of privilege attaching to each of them. While, yes, my father was a professional, he was a chartered accountant, and I lived a middle-class life. But it was middle-class life with a degree of chaos and some lacks in it, shall we say. And so therefore I never really saw myself as middle class. I was the boy in the class. I was at the tail end I'm one of 8 children, and I was towards the end of them. So the clothes I wore had been worn by others before me, and possibly the shoes, as I was a child. And so I saw myself in that context. So I never saw myself as middle class. And it wasn't until, in fact, it was at a men's development network summer school residential where a man from Derry, which is a very working class context, challenged me and said, of course you're middle class, everything about you is middle class. And I was, and I had become avowedly middle class. But it took me until then, in my mid-40s, to acknowledge that I was, and that I had acquired privilege attaching to that. When I was working in business, I turned up at the boardroom tables of some of the biggest companies in Ireland, at the boardroom tables of the ministries facing the ministers, in one case the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach as we call him here. So I was very definitely middle class, and I had that access and that power. I had to learn in pretty well the same way that as a man, I had a gender, because in my 30s, what did I know about gender? There was women's studies, in the library and in Waterstones. And it became gender studies, but the only thing to do with men was to do with queer studies at that time. So I actually had to discover that masculinity was a thing, and that I had a gender, and patriarchy existed. And I remember, now Raewyn Connell standing in Trinity College using the word hegemonic patriarchal dividend. And I will never forget it, because I was still living in that stage of my life where I was wrestling with the deficit effect of masculinity. So I had to learn that piece of privilege as well. And much more recently, where race walked in the door, and it was at a Men Engaged meeting. A woman of colour from the US looked around the room and said, I want to hear from a white man. There weren't that many white men in the room. And I took the microphone, and for the first time I said, I am an old white Irish man, and that what I know about race is very little. I remember in the 70s travelling to the UK to work and being surprised at the number of men and women working on the underground who were black. When Ireland was a monoglot, single culture, single colour. So I had to go through all of those steps, and that's the journey of getting here, is to see those. And I've been involved with Men Engage since 2009 in one fashion or another, and it taught me really clearly how to understand my background, my identity, but also see others really clearly, because Men Engage is a place with people of courage, and that's what they expect of me when I'm there. And I've never been more grateful. I describe myself as feminist in how I approach things. Sometimes I hear the word pro-feminist, and it's not clear enough for me. It's not definite enough for me. I am very definitely feminist in my thinking, I hope, and learning, and that is the piece. Here I am. I've just passed my 71st birthday, and I still have to learn fundamental things about the world.
It makes me think, I suppose sometimes in kind of, Men Engage circles and things, we talk about perhaps like doing inner work. And I know that's something which you take really seriously, and you're kind of pointing to there. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could perhaps just say a little bit about, what does that mean to you? What does it involve to you? And why is it important that, men like us do that kind of inner work, right, in your view?
I think that we don't have any choice. Because it's not all in the head, it's in the whole of us. I carry it all. When I feel fear, it's not a rational thing, it's down here in the gut, and I know it because I'm asked to listen to it, and that's where the inner work comes in. I'm asked, and I've been taught to listen to it, and asked to respond to it. So to come away from that meeting where I was asked, I want to hear from a white man. That was in response. We were sitting in a big room. There were a table with 4 sides, if you like, and there was about 40 people. And the people facing me, when I walked into the room, there was my habit when I walk into a room of mostly new people is to sit with people that I don't know. That's my habit. And that's to do with my nervousness and my fear. And I looked around, and there was an array of people of colour on the other side of the table with one seat. And I looked, and I discerned quite quickly that that was not the place to take. So these were people from Africa and what they would have described, or did describe, the African diaspora. And they had come together and sat together in solidarity with themselves. And I raised the question because the question was live in me. I said, I reported what I said, and they explained really clearly. Well, they didn't know each other in the main, but they sat to be with each other, to be with their brothers and sisters of colour. And it was a really powerful moment, And I left that meeting with that sitting on my shoulder. And I have been using it to prod myself into becoming, understanding how it is that I am each of those things. And that's the inner work as far as I'm concerned. That's when I have to put my feet on the floor and just be with it, and to be able to hear and work with the idea that I have a sexist past. I hope that it is a past. And I have been racist in terms of things that I have done or not done, and be aware of it and be conscious of it and learn from it. For me, that's the inner work. Otherwise, we skate past. We're like a dragonfly skating across the top of the pond. We just don't go deep. And until we do, it is down in the depths. There be the monsters. That's the value of inner work.
So I suppose there's an element as well where it's beneficial to yourself as well, I suppose, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's how I face whatever it is I have to face. As I said, the number of times I've said to myself, God, I thought I dealt with that. And suddenly there it is again. Maybe brought up by a question or whatever. And I've learned that I can't ignore those things, that I really have to look them in the eye.
Yeah, I mean, I get the impression that something which might have caused some kind of reflection among at least perhaps some men in Ireland was the murder earlier this year, the horrible murder of Aisling Murphy, a 23-year-old primary school teacher who was attacked and killed while she was jogging on the 21st of January this year. So I was just wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about, what impact has this case had in Ireland, in your view? Has there been more discussion about men's violence towards women, and do you think that things are moving forwards in Ireland in that regard, or what's your view?
I think they are. I think they very definitely are. That I think they're I'm silenced a bit by that. What's that about? I think, yes, violence against women and other marginalised communities is very definitely receives instant opprobrium. Instant. But I think there is a layer underneath there that says, I wonder if she was brown, would the same thing happen? And I'm increasingly uncomfortable about how we are with race in Ireland. We have been a monoglot culture for so long. We have been, when I was growing up, there were two kinds of people in Ireland. There were Catholics and something called non-Catholics. That was the language. And when we began to have migrants arriving in Ireland, we had nationals and non-nationals. That was the way we spoke about the difference. In other words, we were really good at othering, And our history is one where we're a post-colonial, colonized place, and we wrestle furiously with what that means to be in the world. And I remember Erin Pizzey, who was the founder of Women's Aid, arriving in Ireland and appearing on the television on the Late Late Show, and she was interviewed. And I remember it because of my own history. I remember seeing it. And the question was, well, was this really needed? Were refuges really required? Within 6 months, I was putting windows in an old Georgian house, which was the first refuge. I think I was 18 at the time. An old Georgian house in the centre of Dublin. We were repairing the windows. It had been given by the developer. It was idle, and we were making, and I remember the steel going on the back of the door. And it was because somebody knew my history and asked me, would I bring my hammer and my saw and put some windows in. So, and the world has moved on. It's acknowledged, it's clear, it's refuges are well supported, not enough, but they are well supported. And in the main, the response to gender-based violence is to talk against it. The difficulty is about engaging with men. The Men's Development Network have the White Ribbon campaign, and they've been really successful. It has been really successful when that self-same Irish soccer team wears a white ribbon when it plays in Ireland. Men's Development Network gets to rattle the bucket at international games. And, so it has got a presence. I think there's a huge amount still to be done in terms of engaging with men about not being bystanders. I think all of that conversation needs to be had.
You said quite a lot just a minute ago about social changes in Irish society. I'm interested that I think you didn't mention, the legalisation of same-sex marriage in 2015. 2018 legalisation of abortion. I mean, these are huge changes for Ireland, which perhaps one couldn't have anticipated really, and in a way they counterpose some of the more reactionary changes that have been going the other way in other countries. But what do you think that says about Irish society today? I mean, is it just the declining power of the Catholic Church, or is it much more complex than that? And
I think that, I'm going to refer to something else very quickly. I don't know enough about English soccer to remember the man's name, the young man who came out as gay. I'm a Guardian reader as well. And one of the pieces of analysis that I saw was that the response was twofold. If you're under 30, the response was, so what? And if you were older than that, it was, isn't it amazing? And it strikes me that both of the same-sex marriage and, in fact, abortion legalisation in Ireland went that way. When for the same-sex marriage change in the Constitution, the most amazing thing that happened was that there were convoys of young people who came home to vote. There were people who got on a plane in Adelaide, Australia, and flew home, voted, and got back on a plane and went back again. There were minibuses and high-ace vans and convoys of cars that filled up the ferries with people coming from the UK. It was organised on social media, and they were all under 30 basically. And they, in fact, the repeal campaign, in fact, both campaigns were built around the notion that people told their stories. So it became personal, and suddenly we knew people, and because we were seeing them, and we knew what they looked like, and they were prepared to stand up, in a way that didn't happen before. I was part of the divorce referendum. There was 5,000 votes won that. That was it. 5,000 votes. And I remember walking around, I was working in an ad agency at the time, I remember walking around the office and checking, saying, do you know somebody in a second relationship? And everyone, there were 60 people in the building, everyone had. And out of that grew a line that was, everybody deserves a second chance. So it wasn't about policy, it wasn't about property, it was everybody deserved a second chance. And we issued instructions to everybody that was appearing in any radio program, any television. The last thing they said was, everybody deserves a second chance. And it was bringing it down home, bringing it personal. And that was an overcoming of fear. We got past what will people say. There were 16 women who told their story of having an abortion and went public on it and put their names on it. And suddenly they're real people. And they became because we expect compassion and empathy, they became not available for attack by the right wing, if that's the appropriate description. And it defeated that. And suddenly, conversations, I remember conversations about zygotes and things like that at previous attempts. Where does life begin? All of that suddenly became irrelevant because it was about people's lives. And people were prepared to stand up and show themselves. I remember on said Late Late Show, which is, there's no equivalent in the UK, but there was an interview with what I can only describe as a little old lady. She was about 80, and she was asked, "And how are you voting?" And she said, "Oh, I'm voting for." And he said, "Why?" She says, "I want my grandson to be happy." And it was kind of, poof, everything got swept aside, I want my grandson to be happy. This was from the part of the population that would be at Mass, not just every Sunday, but probably several times a week. So yeah, it's a changed place.
It's so great that all those changes have happened, isn't it? It's just extraordinary, really. But I could listen to you all day, actually, Shay, but I'm thinking that maybe time is against us.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Sandy. I also could listen to you talk all day. But yeah, we probably should bring it to a conclusion. But yeah, first we thought, because I think you engage in writing yourself, don't you? So would you like to read, would you describe it as a poem or a kind of piece of writing about being an older man?
It was a piece of writing that set out to be some kind of a reflection on older men's masculinities, and it started off as old man's masculinity, and then I stuck in the front of it an old man's masculinity as a way of, because it had become just really about me and where I had got to, and I hope it's true. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, an old man's masculinities. As I grow old, my body changes, weakens, adjusts to the physical work, whatever it is, that it has done over the last 70 years. My mind is sharp, able to connect the dots, using the practice developed as a boy, as a young man, as a mature adult man, then as what I describe as an adept man, now as a reflective man. My emotions are fluid and more available. My practice of reflection allows time and space for consideration of the feelings and the needs of my heart and soul. My openness to connection among men supports each of these and challenges me to acknowledge the part other men play in how I have changed and am changing as I age. I feel no less of a man, in fact, more of a man, as I let more and more in through the barriers that I learned so well to erect as part of my survival. I learned to swallow my tears, shown to be unwelcome as a schoolboy in the 50s. I relearned to let them flow when I felt safe, encouraged and supported by other men. I learned to numb out rather than feel the terror of living with the threat of chaos and violence. I slowly relearned to allow the experience of feeling sadness, fear, terror, anger. And I learned to live with the fear that it wouldn't survive the feelings. And I did survive. And I learned that the emotions were not in control. I learned that I could manage how I was without going numb. In a culture at school where athletic prowess was the signifier of an able young man, my lack of coordination marked me as an outsider. Because there was no expectation at home for me to perform, I cared little for this inclusion. If I had been academically lacking, I suspect I would have met with more condemnation. This lack of physical presence stayed with me through adolescence and into adulthood. I've never been engaged in sport or indeed interested even as a spectator. I had no sense of myself as a strong physical being notwithstanding being 6 foot tall. Sitting with men and finding and offering good attention, sharing time and space, creating community. This is what allows me to discover my courage, and along with the struggle came the celebration of joy, delight, connection and words.
Thanks so much, Shay. That seems to me to be such a powerful summary of who you are and what you do, you know?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I feel a bit emotional actually just listening to you, so I might have to stop now before I wobble off completely. But thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah. Wobbling off is okay.
That's true.
Thank you both.
Well, thank you so much, Shay, for
Thanks,
sharing
Shay.
with us a lot that you have shared with us, and for all the great work you do. I feel like we could all probably learn a lot from your approach and the work you're doing, and there's a need for a lot more of it, I think, isn't there? So.
Well, Stephen, that was quite an emotional interview, I thought, with Shay there. What did you make of it?
Yes, I agree, really. I mean, yeah, it was emotional and moving, as you say. And actually, I felt quite hopeful towards the end when he was talking about the situation in Ireland and, you know, how Irish society has changed and some of the big changes that have happened in recent years about marriage, about abortion, these kinds of things, you know, moves towards gender equality. It kind of shows you what's possible, especially in a world where, you know, unfortunately there are lots of bad things happening in that respect. Obviously, in the US, the situation with Roe versus Wade, for example, like clearly abortion rights is something which we can never take for granted. But it shows that this kind of positive change is possible, doesn't it? And perhaps it's something to reflect on as well for us here in the UK, you know, at a time when our country is in quite a lot of kind of turbulence and turmoil about things like Brexit, that things can be done differently. And also with refugees, for example, you know, Ireland has been, I think, hosting a lot more refugees than the UK has in recent years as well. So yeah, I think perhaps it's showing us how to do things in a different way in some ways. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating to hear him talk about some of the social changes that have happened and how significant those obviously are. And what occurs to me is that in some ways, you know, what Shay said about his own life mirrors some of the social changes that have happened in Ireland more generally, really. I mean, he talked about growing up in, you know, what sounds like quite a sort of middle class, but also restrictive and potentially violent or actually violent at times, and moving through the changes in his life towards a position where he's saying that, you know, he's a feminist practitioner. I mean, that's quite a journey that you're talking about there, really, isn't it? You know, and he also mentioned key sort of transition moments along the way for him, you know, particularly moving from the corporate world to giving that up and his focus now on inner work. You know, that's a fascinating transition he had there. And obviously the moment of retirement or leaving work can be a key moment for men where they reassess where they're at. But also it's a moment where they may lose a lot of their social networks, a lot of their friends, you know, based primarily around work. I mean, obviously that can happen for women too, but I think particularly so for men, for whom work is so central, really. And he also mentioned, and we didn't even pick it up actually, the fact that he'd had a heart attack, you know, and health issues again can be moments where men can think about, you know, where they've got to, where they want to be, what they need to change. So yeah, that was powerful for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These different pivotal moments in men's lives can be real moments of reflection and potential change or, you know, adaptation, moving in different ways. As Shay has done all these different things in his life and had that real journey, as you say. I thought as well it was interesting what he said about men's health and how, you know, when he went to the doctor, actually she was saying, like, you know, well, I can give these to your wife. And there's something interesting there, isn't there, about how perhaps sometimes still women are responsibilized, you know, to look after men. And I suppose, yeah, like obviously the work Shay's doing, it really highlights how men can and should, you know, how we have a lot to gain from reflecting more on how we can look after ourselves, how we can look after each other. And I think it shows as well, like what he was saying about the real value and impact and power of this kind of group work, which he does. You know, when it's done well, when you've got good facilitators, I think that can have such an impact, kind of just being in a room with other people, talking about issues which perhaps we don't talk about a lot, perhaps especially among men, not encouraged to talk about things like your emotions, your inner turmoils, your difficulties, what's happening in your life. The men he talked about obviously going through some really difficult issues, a lot of them, and just the value of being in a group and having, those questions asked and discussed with each other. I think, it's just it can be so powerful, can't it? And I just think we need so much more of that. I think that can have a real positive impact on individual people and potentially, in instigating social change that we want to see as well.
It's interesting that the focus on older men there as well, I think, in that, a lot of our sort of policy and practice responses these days are geared at younger men, particularly sort of the youth group or younger. And in a way, older men can perhaps be forgotten to some extent. And, it reminded me of when I did a piece of research for Age Concern, as it then was, now incorporated to Age UK, about the needs of socially isolated older men, particularly the kind of group that Shay was describing. I went to pub clubs in Gateshead, I went to a day centre in Birmingham, and talked to the guys there. And I really got a sense of how sort of invisible their lives were, particularly for those who are living alone. I think for men who have partners, as you're saying, it can be very different and they can fare much better, but partly because they're being looked after. But for men on their own, they're not very visible. And I think as one of them said to me, well, older men don't make a fuss. And I think that's generally true. And it was interesting to have Shay describe the power of the groups he's a member of and runs, and how even in older life men can access their emotional lives and think through what's happened to them through their life course. So yeah, there's definitely a huge value in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also can't help but think about, with the situation with COVID, obviously, like what impact has that had? I mean, as Shay mentioned, on the one hand, obviously, lots of older men in particular have died or suffered severe health implications, but also, like, obviously, things have increasingly moved online. There's perhaps more social isolation as a result of the pandemic. So, yeah, what impact has that had on a lot of older men? I think that's something really important to consider, isn't it?
Yeah.
But we should probably wind things up, I think, at that point. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for listening.
Yes, thanks indeed, and speak to you again.
Yes, and please do get in touch with us at nowmen@gmail.com if you've got questions or issues you'd like us to discuss on the podcast. We very much welcome that, and do share the podcast with your friends as well. Otherwise, we'll be speaking to you again soon, hopefully. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.